Hey everybody, and welcome back to Bottomless Coffee with Jerome. Today we are speaking with Dr. John Gatermann, he, him. John specializes in working with the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, that's a mouthful, providing assessment and therapeutic services to early childhood all the way up through late adulthood. Dr. Gatermann works from a trauma-informed intersectional framework which enables him to understand the complexities of identity and mental health care. Therapeutically, he believes that people are the masters of their own journey and that therapy can be a light that illuminates the paths that lie ahead. Welcome, John. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me today.
I am really excited to kind of work through that explanation of your work, but one thing I think that definition includes is gender affirming care. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, and what is it like having such a low key, under the radar job, John?
Yeah, especially recently with recent events. I really enjoy the work that I do. I do promote myself as a gender affirming care psychologist. That comes with lots of responsibilities, lots of things to be aware of. Like I said, from a social political lens, especially recently, it's not always been the safest way to kind of promote yourself. However, I think it's important, especially as we serve the trans community and non-binary folks.
I agree that's very important. Obviously, my trans siblings were really excited that we're going to have this conversation today. But I do want to kind of step back and just get to know you a little bit more. Like, how did you come to psychology as a profession?
Well, psychology wasn't always my interest, actually.
Oh, no way.
No, in undergrad, I was going to study veterinarian science.
Okay.
And so I entered pre-vet school when I was living in Missouri. And on the first day, arriving on campus, I could not find my way to my classroom. People who know me, who are close to me, know I'm directionally impaired.
Oh, okay.
So it's not out of the normal for me. However, I ran into my soon-to-be advisor, Dr. Colleen Beery, and she sat me down in her office and was trying to help calm my nerves and make me feel very welcomed to the campus. And we had a conversation about what my interests were. Long story short, I left there with changing my major to psychology. And that's where kind of my story in psychology begins.
And that was just a general interest in psychology at that point. Sure.
Yeah, exploring. I mean, she really helped me understand that I had a love for animals, and that was what was drawing me to veterinarian school. However, I had a stronger interest in understanding people, understanding how we can bring empathy and compassion to people to improve their lives, and so that's where that conversation started.
So you speak with your advisor, you go through school, many years of school.
Yep.
What was your first job?
Yeah, I guess I should talk about it a little bit. So, to become a psychologist, it is a long process. Takes 8 total years.
Oh my gosh!
Sometimes 10, depending on what blockades you encounter. But during that, you do 4 years of undergrad, and then you enter graduate school for another 4 years. During graduate school, that's when we have our first clinical experiences. And mine was with the correctional facility for the state. And I started working with elders in the community and working with a lot of neurocognitive disorders, so traumatic brain injuries, dementia, Alzheimer's, things like that.
Sure.
And doing full assessments. And what I learned from my clients was that they wish these services were offered earlier. So even today, being a child and adolescent provider, in addition to an adult provider, we don't have a lot of psychologists who provide services to young people.
And I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so I really was intentional about where I found my next practicum experiences. I'll say practicum are just unpaid internships.
Oh, okay. It sounds fancier to call it practicum.
Yeah. So it's kind of where they work around that. But yeah, and so I ventured into working with child and adolescent mental health, and that's what led me to working with the queer community.
Okay, so how did that happen?
Yeah.
And was it intentional, or was the job available?
At the same time of graduate school, I was working through a lot of my own biases around race, around sexual orientation, around gender identity.
Oh.
I knew that I was gay since the age of 5, but growing up in Missouri, that was not a safe space to. Where I grew up in Missouri was not safe to come out, and so as I was going through my own journey. I started to develop an interest in queer mental health care. And so that's where it started.
Yeah.
And then as we've seen recently, young people are really grappling with sexual orientation and gender identity at earlier ages. And that was my entry point. And I knew I needed to learn more. In graduate school, you don't get a lot of training in queer studies, and so there's a lot of outside development.
Okay, so I just want to confirm you had 8 to 10 years of formal education.
Yes.
Then you went into work and practice. Mm-hmm. Then you came into gender affirming care.
Yeah, gender affirming care came later.
Okay, still later. Okay, there are a lot of armchair gender affirming care experts out there recently.
Absolutely.
And I'm just really, I'm wondering how much education they have on the topic. So we're not even there yet for you. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, a lot of people have opinions,
Yeah.
and they're very confident.
Stinky.
Very confident about sharing their opinions on things, which has made it hard for professionals too. But my entry point into gender affirming care came while working in community mental health. And being an out gay man, I was getting a lot of referrals for everybody under the 2S LGBTQI plus.
Yeah, I bet.
Acronym. But there's a lot of differences between treating someone who's identifying as gay, bi, lesbian, pansexual, and somebody who's identifying or grappling with their trans identity or non-binary identity. Those are two starkly different things. And so I needed to develop a competency in working, or at least from a responsiveness place with working with the trans community. And so that took an additional 4 to 5 years.
Oh my gosh.
Before my competency was really developed.
Well, I don't know if this is inappropriate or not. You don't look old enough to have all this experience, so.
I went right from.
Kudos.
Thank you. Yep. It's,
Right, same here.
Yep.
Well, okay. So we understand your path to how you got to be on, let's say, one side of the desk or in one of the chairs in your office.
That's a nice way of putting it.
What is the path, if there's a general path that you've uncovered in your experience, what is the path that typically leads people into your office?
Ooh, that's complicated. A lot of people will enter therapeutic spaces for a variety of reasons, whether they've experienced a recent loss, someone close to them has died, and they're struggling with grief. Other people are having more of an internal struggle inside themselves, whether it's around identity, spirituality, or just feeling conflicted. Some people have sensed an underlying mental health condition like depression or anxiety and are ready to start to confront that and seek to understanding. So people's entry points are quite different and vast. That's what makes the work interesting, though, because you don't know what people are going to present with when they come into a shared space with you.
Do people come to you and say, you're working with the person who's trans. Mm-hmm. Do they come to you knowing, self-identifying as trans, or do they have conversations with you over a long period of time and then eventually come to terms with it, or is it all of the above?
That's a really good question. people who are starting to grapple with gender identity, as I said, are doing it at a younger age now. Not to say that we don't have elders in the community still grappling with gender identity, but there's a little bit more space to actually explore that part of self. So people are entering at different kind of stages of development, and I would say that we all grapple with our gender identity. We all grapple with our sexual orientation. It just depends on how much we actually talk about it and how much space we have to do it, whether it's in isolation or being more open with family and friends. And what we're seeing is the latter. People are able to be more open and safe with their friends and family. And so some people will come with questions around, hey, I don't quite feel like my sex assignment at birth, and that's the starting point. And it's a very just kind of walking alongside your client as they grapple with their gender identity. Some people come that they're very much more have already processed, have already integrated large components of your identity, and are ready to start making some transitions. And transitions don't necessarily have to be medical transitions. Social transitions are a huge component of their exploration of themselves. So.
Fascinating. Because I think a lot of people, me in particular, really do get hung up on the medical component of transitioning. And in a recent podcast episode, when I was having a conversation with someone about how I, as a cis gay man, can be a better ally to my trans siblings, I was like, well, maybe start by deconstructing the constructs, right? Like, I feel like some people might feel bad about who they are inside because everything outside is telling them that they're supposed to feel bad for wanting to swim against the current. But, if I'm a 40-year-old woman and I want gender affirming care, then that includes Botox, that's like a facelift, that's breast augmentation surgery, and I don't think that everyone who gets those things feels like they need to go seek out a specialist and have a conversation about their inner conflicts, right?
Yeah, that's very true. And it's really well said.
I also don't hear any politicians talking about banning breast augmentation.
I do not either. So these are all really good points, Jerome. I think that's the frustrating nature of the work. We are focusing on one group while not acknowledging how this would impact everybody. Bans on gender affirming care impact everybody.
Yeah.
And again, it's not just a focus on medical interventions, but that's what politicians have focused on. And I got to take a step back too, right? We're two cis gay males talking about trans identity, and that's a struggle too, right? Because here we are placed in these positions where we hold a lot of privilege with our cisness, and we're the ones engaged in this conversation.
Yeah.
Right? And so I'm always kind of cautious in modulating how I talk. I'm talking about it from my one perspective and not being able to talk from a trans identity perspective. And so being clear about that.
Yeah.
With that being said, when I look at interventions, I'm really trying to support my clients on where they're at while doing things like this to spread awareness and education so that we do deconstruct those barriers to healthcare. There's a lot when it comes to the trans community. So much so that in my work in community mental health, a lot of people will come into my office just exhausted by having to piece together their services.
Oh, yeah.
And not everybody knows those services. And recently we have new transplants from states that aren't affirming or who have banned gender affirming care. And now they're in a whole new city and they have to find those services and where those are located. So it's a lot of education. It's a lot of talking about what types of transitions are possible. Not every trans person or non-binary person is going to seek out medical interventions.
Yeah.
And sometimes a lot of my work is to help people get to a place where they understand what will be right for them in their healthcare.
That sounds very fulfilling. Yeah. Now you took a step back, so I'm also going to take a step back. And I mentioned a previous podcast episode and another previous podcast episode. I was having a great conversation with a comedian also named John, go
Okay.
fig. And he, in his mind, a lot of trauma in the gay community is expressed through substance abuse, a lot of wild partying, and certainly not self-care, let's say.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if, in your mind, you think maybe generally speaking, at least with the society that we're going through now, if you think more people in the queer community should be seeking out therapeutic services, or if there are enough supports in the broader community to where maybe it's not a general recommendation for everyone, but
Yeah, that's an excellent question too, and you're exactly right. Substance use, mental health, underlying mental health conditions, and suicide rates are much higher in the 2S LGBTQI plus community. And when we break that down to breaking the acronym apart, there's some varying levels of some, especially with the trans community and young trans folks, people under the age 18, those rates increase even more. And so, should everybody seek out mental health care? No, I'm not. I'm not saying everybody needs to. But the research supports that people who are struggling with mental health conditions or substance use who do seek out services are better off than those who do not. And that's a very strong research that supports that. And so my encouragement, I guess, would be that people from the queer community seek out what services are going to help them have a fulfilling life.
yeah.
There's a lot. When you enter out in the world, you are just bombarded with lots of societal pressure, boxes to check, and we don't all fit nice and tidy into those boxes. It's a lot of pressure. Working with young people, I always think about, as they go into school and how many boxes they have to check, just to learn. Right?
Yeah.
I'm just entering the classroom, I want to learn, and now it's like I'm inundated with all these certain categories, and so it's a real challenge. And so I hope people can feel comfortable seeking services. I hope they feel encouraged by seeking mental health services, and that it doesn't become, we don't further the stigma around it, we actually start to deconstruct it.
Well, what do you do when you're first meeting a client to make them feel comfortable?
Well, I am large, so I mean, if you think about it, so when I go and get a client, I'm 6'6", I'm a white cis gay man, but most people just see me as a white male, right? And I prepare people because I usually do, phone intakes and whatnot. I tell people, and especially since when we were still doing telehealth, and I'd see clients for the first time after a year not seeing them in person.
Yeah.
I try to warn them and prepare them. I'm a large presence. And they're still very shocked by it. So,
Is that why you're so soft-spoken? Is that intentional?
that is interesting. So you are probably the third person who's asked me that.
Yeah.
I have been soft-spoken most of my life, but for the first 15 years of my life, I struggled with a profound stutter. And so coping with that was to not talk or to not be heard. So I always kept my voice low. And it's just kind of become my affectation of sorts.
Fascinating. Okay, well, you mentioned telehealth and coming out of it, and so I'm sensing there are some COVID stories there. But let's take a quick coffee break.
Sounds good.
And then we'll be right back with Dr. John Gatermann. Hey y'all, I wanted to take a second to thank Kiehl's for their support of the LGBTQ community. This year for Pride, Bottomless Coffee partnered with Kiehl's and hosted Pride Trivia at the Kiehl's in the Mall of America. It was educational, it was enlightening, and it was a really fun time. I had no idea that Kiehl's has been supporting our community for over 20 years, but I do now. If you happen to find yourself in Minnesota, be sure to drop by the Kiehl's in the Mall of America to say hi. And please do tell them that Jerome sent you. That's not good for a discount, but you'll definitely get some brownie points. Okay, let's get back to the conversation. Well, welcome back to Bottomless Coffee with Jerome. We're having a wonderful conversation with Dr. John Gatermann. You can connect with John on LinkedIn. Just type it in and look him up. So you'd mentioned COVID in the last, well, you mentioned telehealth.
Telehealth, yes.
And in my mind, I was like, oh, he had a COVID experience and he's a doctor. I bet he's got some interesting stories. So I kind of want to go through and help remind myself and others just about like everything we all collectively went through. Because I think maybe one trauma response is just to kind of forget 3 years of our lives.
Yeah.
Which is not healthy. It's not healthy, everyone. So generally speaking, how was the experience? And then let's get into the particulars.
Yeah, denial and repression. It was great. No.
If that's your professional opinion.
Yeah, everybody should do that. I think we're still trying to sort through everything that transpired during COVID.
Yeah.
What a collective case study on isolation, loneliness, fear, impending doom. I imagine a lot of people are still grappling with that. Those are big emotions that don't metabolize easily, and so you saw a lot of people enter in therapy for the first time
During
COVID. Yeah.
That's tough.
Now there might be some contributing factors to that. As mentioned, telehealth. As we were scrambling as mental health professionals, we had to develop competencies in providing telehealth care pretty quickly. Fortunately, there was some large organizations like the American Psychological Association that put out continuing education for free for therapists, so we could become competent in providing telehealth care, because the ethical land is different than in person.
Oh, how do you mean?
What I mean by that is, so you got to sort through when people are struggling with self-harming ideation, so suicidal thoughts, things of that nature, and if you're needing to transport to like a medical facility for a full kind of risk assessment, we have to know how to do that over telehealth, because now the person's not in front of me, the person's somewhere out in society, right? And then you got to traverse landscapes around, well, now I'm bringing telehealth to you into your room. Are you in a private space, right? Because you still want to be mindful of confidentiality. That's what makes therapy work. Also, you got to look at where you can practice, right? Typically, I can't speak on all boards, but you can't practice outside of Minnesota as a psychologist, right? Unless you're licensed with other states or you have a reciprocity with a state. And so if your client is vacationing, say in Wisconsin or somewhere, and they want to do their therapy appointment, you have to talk about how you can't do that because they're not in the state.
Oh, I had no idea. That's really interesting.
Yeah, so different for different boards, but you have to be mindful of those things, and especially around ethics. There's lots of other things, and so training on the onset was very important before we ventured into telehealth.
Were you considered essential workers?
I think some of us were, but when we were able to transition to working at home, we weren't considered essential workers in the same respect as somebody who were going in. People on the front lines who were having to go into the office and still be around the public. We were really still pretty kind of in the background, if you will.
Do you have colleagues in your workplace who are medical doctors and are having to go through the experience of COVID?
Yeah, I have many colleagues and friends who are in the medical community and who are going into work every day. I cannot speak to what their experiences were, because it sounded very traumatizing, having to isolate from family and friends, not being able to be around their loved ones when they come home from work. Some people not even being able to enter the home out of fear of spreading the virus to their family and friends. So I'm cautious to speak on their experience, but yeah, absolutely, it was they were going in.
Well, I'm just wondering if any doctors and nurses and what have you felt that they should seek out a mental health service, like some supports there for that really.
Yeah.
incredible amount of stress that they were under, and in some places maybe still are.
Yeah. I imagine there were a lot of people in the medical field who either during or post-COVID, what that means, who have found themselves across from a therapist. And in a good way. I mean, that's a positive thing, because nobody was prepared for what we went through. Many of us didn't know if there was a playbook for the pandemic, but also, even medical professionals have a human response. And I think that was what really was the catalyst to bring people into the therapy space. So,
did you encounter any vaccine hesitancy during your practice?
In my work and just around in general, there was vaccine hesitancy. I heard a lot around, the speediness or the quickness of how the vaccine was rolled out, and concerns that was the vaccine safe to take, and so a lot of just misconceptions. I really relied on my medical professional colleagues to inform my own perspective of the vaccine, which I think was vital, especially when there was a lot of misinformation out there.
I was like, get this vaccine in my arm. I was really like taking my life in my own. I got the Johnson & Johnson one, So.
Okay.
Woo.
you were ready.
Risky. Followed up with Moderna, but I have not been very good about getting the boosters like I'm supposed to. And it's kind of a part of healthcare. Does like taking care of yourself, does that come up in your conversations with clients at all?
Yeah, I'm always encouraging people to do what's called preventative healthcare. So getting your annual screenings, always seeing, at least, doing a full physical once a year. It's just part of really healthy practices. I got to be careful though too, because people's experiences of the healthcare system haven't always been great. And when you when you look at, or you take a historical lens, it hasn't been great. There's been a lot of atrocities that have been perpetuated by the healthcare system, and so I'm always mindful of, when I engage in conversations around preventative healthcare, how that could trigger people, and what that means for people.
I've had conversations on this as well. The conversation here is a little bit different from the conversation I might have in like a Black setting, right? Or with family or friends or what have you. And we actually had the director of vaccine equity for the state of Minnesota, who came in and was sitting in a different chair, but right opposite. And I remember in that conversation how I was thinking, okay, I felt safer getting the vaccine because they weren't like, all right, all the Black people to the front of the line. There was a period where I just could not get access. And so, but I was watching the data to make sure that the people who were first were doing okay. And that made me a lot more comfortable. So I'll go second. Well, I'll be real quick on second.
I think that experience is accurate. It's and we don't have conversations around race and the healthcare settings. I mean, recently we have, right? But by and large, a lot of white people had not haven't even known the history. And so I think your experience is extremely accurate. There's a lot of stepping back and waiting and what is this about before I enter into it?
So early days in lockdown, vaccine, and then kind of coming out of the pandemic. Coming out. How did you find that your clients had experienced all that in 30 seconds or less?
All right. It was challenging. I remember leaving work and being rushed out, and it was just kind of, everybody was just in kind of a discombobulated state. So I can only imagine what clients were experiencing. Working with a lot of young people, just a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainties. What does this mean for school? What does this mean for graduation? There's a lot of missed graduations. That was hard to deal with. A lot of people who, caregivers who are now teachers, friends, social support, pulling on all these different roles and where that they're ill-equipped for, while still providing for the family, right? And so it was a lot of unknowns.
So there's a phrase in your bio, and it's the complexities of identity and mental health care.
Yeah.
And I'm very curious about that phrase in particular and how you think the pandemic impacted the complexities of our identity and mental health care.
Yeah. So this is specific to my practice because depending on what your theoretical orientation is, which is just a fancy way of how do you approach therapy, I feel that in order to do the work that I do, you have to approach it from an identity focused perspective. People arrive in your office and they're sometimes confused about who they are, their sense of self. And so you always want to do an exploration of identity markers, whether it's from sexual orientation, gender identity, race, ethnicity, nationality, ability, spirituality, religion, you name it, right? We hold these different components of our identity. And a lot of the times we have to modulate which identity markers show up in spaces that we take up, right? So if you go into work, you have to be mindful of how different components of your identity are going to be allowed space to show up.
Yeah. So I think you might be using the identity markers to like figure out the construct that your clients are like living in, and maybe trying to identify which parts are experiencing the pressure that's leading them to conflict.
It's a good way of summarizing it. Yeah.
It's a cool rubric. Yeah.
So, and this model is not my own. So identity work's been going on for a long time, and Kimberly Crenshaw did a lot of this work and introduced the concept of intersectionality to us, which has been a term that we are mostly familiar with these days, right?
Yeah.
And so she developed this kind of understanding, and now it's moved into more of a framework for understanding the human condition. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what did you find coming out? Like, what is, anecdotally speaking, like, how are people doing? Because I don't think we often get to hear. We don't really know how people are doing. I think we're at home, we're by ourselves sometimes, and we're like, I think I process things okay. Maybe.
Yeah.
It's not on TV. It's not on the radio. We're not talking about it.
No, we're not. And idle minds, right?
Yeah.
That's sometimes dangerous.
Yeah.
And I think for some of us, we were really fortunate to have people in our bubble that came together, but there was a lot of people who didn't, who lived alone, who maybe are a little more socially isolated, and that was their preference, but we all crave social connection at some degree.
Yeah.
Right. And so some people were really, really struggling. Then if you focus more on an age and you look at young people under the age of 18, there's a lot of developmental milestones that we have to hit, and those were not being hit. We hit those through social engagement. And so here you have, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds who are not hitting those developmental milestones like we once were when we were all in the classroom. Yeah. So it was very complex to kind of understand what was happening to our human experience, whether you're a young person or an adult. And then we were being taught to fear one another.
Accurate. Yeah.
And what that's done to us as a human race. And there was already, depending on what your experience of the world has been, there's been fear of each other, right, in a lot of capacities, and we don't need to go down that route. But now we had a collective fear that you could harm me just by talking with me.
Right. We mentioned isolation. Mm-hmm. So I still serve on the Public Health Advisory Committee for the City of Minneapolis, at least as of this taping. Taping. And I want to at least express that I'm hearing a lot about isolation and mental health and like loneliness in particular.
Yeah.
And I don't really get lonely because I've got like a dog and a husband and like people all up in my business all the time.
Opposite end of the spectrum.
But I have to acknowledge, yeah, exactly. Like I'm hearing this over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And I think the Surgeon General on Twitter said something about it. And so has this made it to you like professionally?
Yeah, absolutely. Loneliness has always been, I don't know if it's outright identified by people, but when you're working in a therapeutic space, it comes up. And so again, helping people uncover what's going on for them. And loneliness is a recurrent theme. What the difficulty is how do you help someone resolve loneliness?
Yeah.
Right, it's different for each person. It's heavily nuanced. What works for you may not work for somebody else, and so it's really helping them confront it head on, but then developing a plan that's individualized for them.
Oh, are you able to speak to one plan that you were able to give that helped?
I'm always cautious of speaking like on specific stories because people's stories are theirs and they're to be honored in the safety of therapy. And so,
Well, then what do you do when you're lonely? How about that?
there you go. I like that question. Like you, I'm rarely lonely. I joke with people because I can do social engagements very well. However, it's depleting. So kind of a true introvert at heart. And so I'm always trying to balance how much, because I can get down the introversion route pretty easily. And so I need people to bring me back into, so I don't venture down there, because that at the bottom of that is loneliness, right? That's what you will find. And so I'm very aware of how I allocate my time. I want to show up for family members. I also want to show up for friends, and those help buffer me against that path down to loneliness.
How might loneliness present if I'm like, let's say I'm on the train and the person next to me is experiencing loneliness? Like, how might that present? Because I don't, why is this person talking to me? You know what I mean? Like, I'm just trying to get from this station to that station, and now all of a sudden someone's attempting human interaction. And I don't know I don't know if they're distracting me while someone tries to take my bag or what have you. So like, what is it that you might look for as a marker of loneliness in someone?
That's a good question. What comes to mind is John Pride's "Hello" in there. Have you heard that song before?
No, I don't think. I had a poet on the show, and John Pride is one of his favorite musicians, I think.
Ah, okay.
That's so funny.
Yeah. It's taking a moment, and this is speaking to the elderly, but taking a moment to actually see somebody. All right, it's not really detecting who is lonely and what they're giving away, because most people aren't going to just broadcast that to the world, okay?
Yeah.
But it's taking a moment each day, and even if it's a complete stranger, just acknowledging that they exist, that's seeing them, looking into their eyes, and just a half smile, and just acknowledging that we are here, and we are definitely, as the cliche now goes, in this together.
Do you feel, or have you noticed, or do you think, pick your question, that there is a stigma around loneliness? Because in the example that I gave, I feel like if the person next to me said, hey, I'm feeling a little lonely, can we talk? I'd be like, oh yeah, sure, that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm actually a professional conversationalist, so you've come to the right place.
Let's do this.
But if they just like launched into the conversation, then I'm like, I don't know why this is happening. Is there a stigma, or are we just like collectively just not comfortable enough to just tell strangers that we need to have a conversation with someone?
I don't think we're really comfortable with difficult emotions. Loneliness ranks high up there. It's a difficult emotion to grapple with, but so is shame.
Yeah.
Right? So is fear. And so if somebody's coming to you on a trade and wanting to talk, and they launch right into this, it's probably activating some fear for you. Like, whoa, what is this person about?
Yeah.
Right? Which is not a bad thing. It's a safety thing. Yeah. But I think in general, we're not comfortable discussing things like fear, shame, loneliness, grief. Those are not emotions we usually sit with. And a lot of the times people are just really wanting you to hear them, wanting you to sit with them, witness their experience, validate it, right? But not telling like, oh, everything's going to be okay, because I can't speak to that.
Yeah.
I don't know your experience of life, but I can definitely witness your pain, and it's not too much for me.
Oh, well, that's so profound, and I'm going to unfortunately ruin it with the husband story. When you sometimes they just want you the conversation and they don't want you to fix anything.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that is between me and my husband Aaron every time. He comes in hot with a story of what went wrong. I was like, what if you did this? He said, actually, I just wanted you to know that this happened and to share this experience with you, not to provide solutions. And so it is like complicated in a different way there. But let's hold off.
Okay.
We are going to take a quick coffee break. I'm actually running very low, which is a crisis. And we will be right back. Welcome back. You did it. You've made it to the final segment of Bottomless Coffee with Jerome. We are speaking with Dr. John Gatermann. You can find him on LinkedIn. Just search LinkedIn, John Gatermann. Now, I think we all want to avoid traumatizing people. You know, not hopefully everyone is trying to avoid traumatizing people. And I think we rarely get the opportunity to speak with someone who converses with a lot of traumatized people. So is there like a route to trauma that we can avoid, or practices that we can take to make sure that we're not inadvertently traumatizing people?
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think we're intentionally trying to inflict trauma on people. But again, to back up a bit, I think trauma has been a word that's entered our lexicon nationally, and quite honestly, I think is overused a bit. And what I mean by that is when we label every negative experience as traumatic, right, it really diminishes our resiliency. Right? And so it's actually the focal point of my work with people, is to help them understand how resilient we are as human beings. And the queer community is a shining example of resiliency. I mean, there's a lot of adversity that we experience, and people under the queer umbrella, different experiences and different degrees of those adversities and challenges. And so, I always caution, it's like, try not to label every negative emotion or a negative experience as a traumatic event. There's also, so I don't know how familiar most of the audience is with Dr. Bruce Perry's work.
He wrote that book with Oprah.
He wrote the book with Oprah, right? And I really enjoy what he says. That if you're wanting to help somebody out and really witness with them, it's asking them what happened to them versus what's wrong with them. And that really kind of redefines how you see trauma. And it pulls you away from like, am I traumatizing somebody or am I helping them build resiliency? Right? I'm not going to change their traumatic experience, right? And nor can I avoid, causing more trauma. But what I can do is take a step back and ask, hey, I know you're going through a tough time. I'm wondering what's happened.
That's nice. I think back to my crazy 20s. It's quite some time ago. And in our community of gay friends in particular, one of the things that would frequently happen is that people would just like stop being friends with other people. Just like immediately, not friends with them. They did something I didn't like, not friends with them, not friends with them. And it wasn't until later, and I also did that. Sorry if that was you, but thanks for watching. Later on, I was like, oh, I feel like that's like a perpetuation of the kind of negativity and oppression that we were feeling at home because I'm of a certain age, right? And it was like, well, if you come out of the closet, you might get kicked out and lose your connection to your family, your support structures, your religion, or what have you. And I was like, oh, we were just doing the same thing back then. that they were doing to us. And I do think that is a traumatic practice. That is something that we could probably easily remove in the queer community if it hasn't been done already. Because I will say the kids are a lot more aware than we were back at the time.
Yeah, I agree with you too. I mean, just to cut people off is not the best practice.
Yeah.
You know, it leaves a lot more questions that deserve answers. And now, that's not to say that everybody experience
right. Healthy boundaries are good.
Some people need to have that ultimate boundary where they cut people off.
Yeah.
But just like ghosting somebody or leaving them on red or anything like that, it's just there's better ways to do it. You know, and especially if if you're being traumatized by somebody, that's a little bit different, right? Someone's abusive relationship and stuff like that, definitely seek resources. But if we're just speaking generally about cutting people off because they made a faux pas or something, I think we can seek to understand first, and then express how that impacted us. And if the person's able to receive that, right, then we'll focus on repair.
And then I think I have at least 30 seconds for this one. This nuance is between queer people and their families. Certainly in that first Trump era, there was a lot of friction.
Yeah.
Cut off those family members, or is engagement the right approach?
You know, it's got to come from a place of emotional safety first, especially for queer folks, because we are in a vulnerable place, and especially as we're coming out, that's an extremely vulnerable place, and so safety has to be part of the equation. If a family member is not safe and holds very stout political and social views, it may be talking with friends and family on how do you best address that, right? Because they're going to know your experience better than most, and they're going to know that person's experience better than most too. And so seeking advice from those safe people can be really helpful in those spaces.
Okay, well, as a safe person, I'm pretty sure you qualify as a safe person.
Maybe. Safety's earned.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. The question is, if you have maybe you could share a story with us about a time that someone came to you for help, the support you were able to provide, and how that support helped them in their life.
Yeah, I think
you were safe at that time with that person.
Yeah, what I mean by safety is earned, just like respect. I mean, when I work with somebody, I'm a stranger, and I reflect on that, like how odd a therapeutic space can be, and I mean, you are opening your most vulnerable parts to someone you don't know, and I recently was reading a book on therapy by Dr. Catherine Gatermann, might be pronouncing that last name wrong, but a Canadian psychologist who's now retired. But she talked about in that book where people don't know us really, right? Because going back to Freudian theory, we're supposed to be this blank slate. And so our clients really don't know us. They open up their entire worlds to us, and the process could unfold over years. And they really don't know a lot about us unless we choose to self-disclose, right? And that can be therapeutic as well. So as people come in, it's really about trying to develop a space that feels safe, that feels where they can start to share parts of their story, their narrative with you. Ways to do that is constantly, like I said, going back to truly seeing somebody, seeking to understand. Say you were a client of mine coming into my office, I would openly talk about my own limitations and my blinders, because we can't remove our perspective of the world. And so we would need to acknowledge that. Me being a white male, you being a black male, we need to talk about those differences.
But you'd go first.
I would go first.
You'd be like, look, I can be vulnerable, and it's okay.
Yeah, I would definitely have to model.
Yeah.
Especially for kids. Right?
Oh, yeah.
If I'm not willing to model behavior, they're not going to open up at all. So there are some nuances to it. What I will say is once that safety is created, the work is truly profound. Almost heroic. Right? So that's it's about the best label I can assign to it.
Oh my gosh, that must feel wonderful when someone finally gets the support that they need and you're able to.
Yeah.
Is it like letting go of a child, you know? It's like, there they go.
Yeah. It's hard because
Off to thrive.
Yeah, it's like when therapy's over, you're like, oh, we're done.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. And, as a psychologist, you're constantly like, okay, well, I can have a human response, but I also need to be professional about it too.
Yes. You're like, how do I feel about this?
And again, therapy is a journey, and a lot of the therapy happens outside of the therapy room. And so people need to have a place where it's like, I think therapy's done for me.
Yeah.
And I'll continue on with what I've learned about myself.
Well, that's wonderful. Yeah. Well, in our closing moments, is there any final message that you want to make sure that our audience takes home with them today?
If you are ready to embark on this journey, therapy may not be the vehicle that resonates with you. You can find, self-exploration through music, through art, through spirituality, religious guidance, through family and friends. But the thing that I want people to know is that when you start to confront those things you've been avoiding, you do start to free yourself.
Yes.
Avoidance is helpful in small doses, but for the long term, it's very detrimental. So as you start to confront those things you've been holding on to, whether it's a slight against a friend or you didn't show up in a space like you wanted to, but you're fully able to look at it and look yourself in the mirror and be like, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And you're going to tell that to yourself and not have somebody else tell you, then you're moving down a good path.
Oh, that's wonderful. Avoidance is not a strategy for success.
Not enduring avoidance. Sometimes we need to healthily avoid, and that's okay.
Well, thank you, Dr. John Gatermann. This has been wonderful.
This has been. Thank you for having me.
A pleasure. And thank you all for tuning in. One last time, I'm Jerome Evans, all over the internet at Jerome T. Evans, and you can stream our episodes and podcasts at bottomlesscoffeeshow.com. Thanks, everybody.